I'd like to invite all of the speakers to please come up over here and engage in a conversation with you. We also have participants online, and I also encourage online colleagues, please do submit your questions, comments, etc. through the multiple platforms you're engaging in. And you can also use the hashtag GFPR 2019 to ask your questions or make comments. And I'd like to go first to the room, and then I will go online. And I will also encourage our panelists to take brief notes if we have more than one question. May I open up to you? Please raise your hand, and the person with a mic will come to you. Tell us your name and institution. And please live up to the IFPRI tradition of not being shy. My goodness, this is the first time I've had a shy audience. Thank you so much. I see Florian at the back. And Mary, if you'd bring the mic to him, we'll take that. And as we do that, I will also encourage the panelists, if you wish to build on each other's remarks, please do so, because this is also an opportunity to have a conversation. But Florian, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this very important report. I think it became clear that the majority of poor people live in rural areas and the majority of hungry people as well. So there really, if the Sustainable Development Goals are to be achieved, we really have to invest more in rural areas. So one term I didn't hear in the discussion is social protection. So if we know that rural areas face many shocks, lack of assets, what do you think is the role of social protection to better enable rural households to cope with these shocks? And as a second comment, there are many young people who actually want to be farmers and work in rural areas. And if you talk to these groups, no matter if it's in the US or in my country, Germany, or in the Global South, they usually have very common challenges, which is access to land, access to assets, access to finance. So in how far does the report also look at empowering youth and young farmer coalitions and actors like this who really want to be farmers and want to revitalize rural areas? Thank you.
Florian, thank you so much. James, would you like to address the question on empowering youth? And then I will come and ask the rest of the panel, Ruth, as well.
Yes, absolutely. So you obviously can't talk about rural employment in Africa without talking about youth employment. And so all indications suggest that most of the jobs that Africa is going to have to create for its young and growing population are going to have to be in rural areas, over half of them. And those issues that you raised, access to land, access to finance and education, these are all absolutely crucial for sort of building the capacity of young people, young women and men to engage in, say, the rural non-farm sector. But research that we've just completed suggests that actually it's not enough. And that while we need to, just as Channing was saying with electricity, bringing electricity on its own doesn't necessarily create all the opportunities that we think electricity can create. And the same is true with education and access to land and so on. We need to build the market environment in rural areas, and that means continuing to invest in infrastructure and in telecommunications and in electrification in order to build those off-farm opportunities. Unfortunately, when you think about all of the trains and the big infrastructure projects that a lot of African governments are investing in, a lot of them are still in the big capital cities. They're not even in the secondary towns. And they're certainly often not stretching into those peri-urban and certainly not the deep rural areas. And so I think we've got a long way to go to show governments that these rural areas need to be an investment priority. And so that's where the agenda, I think, needs to focus around youth employment and job creation. Thanks.
Thank you. And before I come to Ruth, I will do a plug for James. He and his co-editors and authors have a book coming out in a few months' time on youth and jobs. Ruth?
To connect it back to the social protection, I'm glad you asked that, because actually the picture of the before and after in India, the organization that fostered that has been trying to connect rural communities to use the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act resources as an investment in environmental restoration. So I think there can be a double win there of generating employment, but also using that to feed into creating greater resilience of the environment. And so I think that is one part. And then just to maybe make some of the connections as you were talking, also investing in like water supply systems. which then reduce women's time, or clean energy for cooking, which India has also been promoting. That we see dramatic decreases in deforestation, for example, when you provide clean cooking energy, cooking fuels, and that also reduces the health burden for women. So I think there are some real possible synergies across these topics.
Ruth, thank you very much. Schengen, and then I'll come
Let me
online.
just also add one issue on subsidies, particularly how we're going to reform subsidies to use that saved funds to create a safety net through social protection. So $500 billion that's spent on food and other subsidies, water subsidies, as well as output price support. So $500 billion. So the social protection in many rural areas can really benefit through that reform. So that less distorting, allocate resources more efficiently, and probably can also bring the poor people to long-term, let's say, income generation opportunities.
Schengen, thank you very much. I will come to online first, and I also noticed we have several authors here, including PK, who is a co-author on the South Asia chapter. If at any time the authors also wish to jump in, please just give me a signal. Let me come online, Lucy.
Hi, thank you. So we have 5 questions.
Why don't you take 3 of them first? I'll go with all 5. Let's see.
Okay, all right, we'll see. Okay, so the first one is from Justin from IFPRI. Climate change is gradually affecting farmers in Africa. What measures have been put in place to combat this challenge? The second one is Dan from World Vision, UK. How can development organizations build the capacity of local government to attract private sector investment, especially for off-farm and non-farm income opportunities? The third one is from Abu. He's a law professor from Bangladesh. Considering the rapid urbanization in the next few decades, as agreed by Dr. Ruth Mason-Dick, how would IFPRI suggest to address the growing food demands? And then there's the last one, is actually one from an email. Dr. Arvind Padhi, Country Director for India, ICRISAT. And this one is towards Dr. Schengen Fan. What is the role of local self-governments in rural revitalization?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a rich set of questions for our panelists. And I'm not sure if you just want to go literally one by one, beginning with Channing, if there's any question you wish to address, and we just go straight down. Channing? The climate change one, perhaps?
Exactly. So yes, climate change is gradually affecting farmers in Africa. I think that energy is one part of this solution. We continue to see high returns to agricultural research, broadly speaking. And because we're going to see climate change rolling in over long periods of time, and because we know there's pretty much a lock-in, another ½ a degree of warming or so, at least over the next 30 years. And I think, to put that into perspective, right, ½ a degree Celsius. So we've had 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to get at least ½ a degree, regardless of what we do, over the next 30 years. And that's on top of the 1 degree that we already have, right? So it's pushing the systems farther from their sort of equilibrium. So we're going to feel a lot of climate change, and it's going to roll in regardless of the mitigation measures that we put in place. So if we keep it to ½ we would be doing quite well by 2050. That's over the next 30 years. We know that agricultural research takes a long time to come into place. It's a long lag process. So now is the time to do that kind of work. I think that's quite important. The other point was on rapid urbanization and food demand, and James mentioned that this is happening in Africa. It's the most rapidly urbanizing. It's also by far with the most population growth. So about 50% of the increment to the world's population is going to be in Africa over the next 30 years, and almost 100% thereafter. And that roughly corresponds with the increment to food demand that you're going to get, especially if Africa's income growth proceeds. And almost surely the best way to meet that demand is with relatively local production. Yeah, trade's going to play a role. There's going to be things, but what we don't want are massive imports into Africa, putting pressure on already pressured systems in the other parts of the world. And, Africa has a lot of yield potential, a lot of gains to do, a lot of land, and this is probably both the most effective in income terms, but also the most environmentally effective way to go about meeting these demands. So thank you.
Thank you, Channing. And let me pass along, and I ask all of you brief so we can take more.
Yep.
Jamie?
Thank you. 2 points. The first is related to the question of climate change. I've seen 2 areas of hope. This is in the area of community-based insurance schemes, such as Insure Resilience, and also community-scale seed banks for crop failures due to climate change. I think we need to move to a shift where corporations bear the burden for resilient supply chains. Secondly, related to what can development agencies do for energy, we need new models of financing. Right now, most investors don't get out of bed for under $100 million. We really need financing for the 1 to 10 million missing middle ticket size. One of the things the United Nations Development Program is doing is working on bundling these small-scale investment ideas and putting them into a ticket size that investors, we hope, will get out of bed for, de-risk those, deploy them, and then move on to the next. Thank you.
Thank you. Danielle?
Thank you. So I think there were 2 questions related to local government. One, I guess, was the role for local governments, and I think it's huge because we are seeing a number of countries where they've had passed either constitutional amendments or legal changes actually devolving agricultural functions to subnational governments. And so the actual responsibility for delivering services, whether we're talking about Ghana, Kenya, Nepal, Pakistan, Zambia, they've all gone through this kind of devolution revolution. So there is a lot of scope for local government. The problem is they often don't have the financial autonomy. A lot of them can't renegotiate tax rates, for example, so they can't actually find ways of raising revenue at the local level. There was another question, I think, from Dan about the capacity of local governments to attract investment from the private sector. I think, again, this goes back to just some basic, somewhat boring issues related to public administration. I just came back from Zambia, visited a town called Pemba, right on the road between Livingston and Lusaka, 2 major urban centers. This council is completely defunct, 3 very decrepit office buildings. No one has their own computer provided by the council. They use personal computer. So when I asked for the budget, they said they couldn't provide it because the previous person had taken it on their computer. They're rotated almost every 6 to 1 year. They have no interest in investing in large-scale schemes at the local level because they know they're not going to be there for a long time. So even at this basic level, integrated software for financial management at the local level, providing just basic equipment, computers, or just basic investments that can have long-term impacts on broader issues such as private investment.
Thank you. Let's bring the mic back this way and take the other one.
Yeah, I wanted to reiterate what Danielle said about 3 components of the central government. Well, it actually applies to local government, even community. The one is you needed to have clear, transparent regulations. That needs to be understood by everybody. The second is the capacity, whether local government, even local community, have the capacity to implement all these different programs, policies, regulations. And the last one is accountability. Yeah, I want to emphasize how important the social media or the internet is in this new world. You can take a photo of a dirty river and put that somewhere in a social media. And then immediately, the local governments will respond. If they don't, it's a big scandal. Somewhere in the newspaper or anywhere else. I think do not underestimate the social media. They can play a huge role. But once we have the regulation, capacity, and accountability, use of social media, modern technology, and I have seen that in many countries, even in Africa. So they can just take a photo, upload somewhere in social media. You put tremendous pressure on politicians.
Ruth?
I want to pick up on the question about attracting private sector investment. By first of all reminding us that the greatest source of private sector investment in the majority of these places are the smallholder farmers themselves. And if we focus only on large-scale foreign capital or even urban capital as the solution, a lot of the things that are done to attract them actually undermine the incentives of the local residents to invest. So I think I like your point about the missing middle of finance and making things available for local residents. Some of the things that are often done to attract this large-scale foreign whatever are, I think, bad ideas. That is providing easy land acquisition, which are often then land grabs from the local people, which makes local residents less likely to invest in their resources. And the second is turning a blind eye to environmental degradation, the pollution that rural industries may be putting out, which then, I've seen this in India where local industries are dumping effluent into the irrigation system, and if the water goes downstream, the cattle that drink it die. But because that's generating jobs and all, we have to keep that, right? No, we don't. I think that is really an important point to raise. We need to rethink this, and some of the ideas on the bioeconomy and such, I think, are important. But let's not forget who are all the investors that we need on that.
Shengen, you wish
So
to
one point
respond,
to
and
what,
then we move to Hazel?
Yeah, just one point to
Speak into the
what
mic, please,
Ruth
Shannon.
mentioned about the land issues. I think sometimes, well, we focus too much on the ownership. I think the rental market, users' rights are equally important, maybe even more important, for land to be consolidated, to increase the size. You know, I can move to cities, but I don't give up my land. That's my life. So you can rent it to a young, smart person, you know, to scale up the production, and maybe even hire local people to that. So I think users' rights and the rental market can really help, not just ownership.
I'm sure we can have a great seminar here, Hazel.
Yes, I wanted to respond to 2 points. First, on the very first social protection question, I just want to say that there are really important gender implications around social protection and on the impact of shocks. I can't do justice to this topic, but IFPRI has done a lot of research on this and how that can exacerbate gender gaps. So just to sort of put a flag on that. The second thing I wanted to talk about was youth. And I think one thing I've noticed is that often when we're talking about empowering the youth, we're really talking about young men. And so, yeah, and so how true is that, right? When you're talking about youth, are you really just talking about young men? And where are the young women, and how are their needs and constraints different from those of young men? Because that will affect how we address this problem. The second thing I wanted to say about the youth is that when we're talking about empowering them, I mean, I put up a definition out there, and really it has 3 components. You have resources, you have agency, you have achievements. And it seems to me that we're doing an okay job. I mean, I think we're doing an okay job addressing the resources part. We're giving credit, we're giving training, we're trying to give them access to different kinds of resources. We also know the kind of achievements we want them to get. We want them to improve productivity, get into high-value occupations, and have higher income. But I think the agency part is missing. Do we really know what the youth want or value? And maybe if we don't, that might be because the youth are not part of the agenda setting. And how do we strengthen that process?
Thank you. James?
Okay, well, let me quickly do a plug for our book again on youth, which is looking at, we have a chapter by Danielle looking at Afrobarometer and looking at some of the demands that youth are expecting from their government. So good read, you should look out for it. But I do want to respond to Ruth, and I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and I think we need to be cautious not to think that if you're not a farmer and you're not small scale, then you are the evil other. And I know that isn't what you're suggesting, but I think to speak to Dan's point from World Vision about how to use local governments to attract private investment, there are a lot of small-scale businesses that are domestic, that are locally grown and looking to expand. And I think they need to have that partnership with government. And they need to have trust in the government and trust that the government will respond to their needs. And I would flag for your attention some work that our sister centre, ILRI, Working in Livestock, is doing, setting up annual forums, or more frequent than that, forums, bringing local government, national government, and the private sector, business associations together to iron out some of their differences so that the government can hear what the needs are and actually respond. And it's a very fragile process. You have to build that trust. But I think we're starting to think along these lines, and they're focusing very much not on the big foreign investors, but on those small local businesses that are in their $1 to $10 million investment range. And I think we should be encouraging them for those off-farm opportunities.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to the room for some questions and comments. And as I do that, I also want to park something in the panelists to come back into the next round. We've been talking about land, but what about access to water? And that's something I also wonder in terms of rural revitalization. But let me come back to the room. I will begin with the gentleman right there next to you, Mary, and then come back here and go around. Let me take 405. And again, please, panelists, take note.
Thank you. I'm José Luis Chicoma. I run a Mexican think tank called Ethos Public Policy Lab. I have two questions mostly related with governance. My main thought about how to change the balance in something that is very concrete on national policies, particularly in Mexico and Latin America, is the budget, the public expenditure on the rural sector, and it's usually forgotten and is minimal. So how do we change that balance? This report is probably going to help, but you need to change the mindset of many of the main stakeholders, and that's a very difficult task. It's not only policymakers and politicians. I guess it's also the priorities of some of the big donors in development policies all over the world, moving the priority from food waste to rural development could be probably one of the big ideas, instead of focusing on win-win solutions, focusing on harder solutions. But I wanted to ask you that. And the second is, you mentioned briefly, one of you, the need to have, or the idea to have, ministries of food systems instead of ministries of agriculture. That could be one of the other answers. Have you seen that change where it happened, had a positive effect?
Thank you very much. There was two people in the front row here. Melissa, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Jorge Tortos. I work for the government of Costa Rica. Based on experience with the Institute for Rural Development, I would like to make some certain questions. Some of them you have already talked about, but is it one related to governance, and is how to expand this intersectoral approach along with a multi-level governability in order to have more efficient policies. And this is also based from a bottom-up politics, how to properly achieve that. And also something else that I would like to ask is related to the diversification of the rural areas from an agricultural dominant perspective towards like a more integrated territorial development, when we can also consider like ecotourism or tourism, culture promotion or artisans or other type of employment. And a third pillar will be like how to tackle social inclusion, but not only within the two major groups that you have mentioned, but also to others like indigenous communities, people with disabilities, or immigrants that are also very sensible within rural communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We pass the mic right next to the lady.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Stanislava. I'm a researcher with King's College London. Thank you all so much for the useful presentations. I have two questions. The first one is if you could talk a little bit about the trends in migration from rural to urban versus sort of population growth in place, and how what are the policy recommendations on those various trends. And the second one is through the prism of conflict. And if you could address, I know it's a big topic, but a little bit about the security implications and the military's involvement in either distribution or access of resources, particularly in the area of logistics, but any other innovative ways that you as practitioners and thought leaders are thinking about where the military could become ever closer involved.
Thank you very much. We'll pass the mic along the same row to the woman, to the lady in the next. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the panel. My name is Joanna Veltri. I recently took up the post as the head of IFAD's DC office. I wanted to ask, basically, if you were to think about, UNDP was mentioned, but in terms of the IFADs of the World Bank, IDA, the regional development banks, what you wish you were seeing in light of all of the research that's been done in the directions that you've sort of highlighted in the various pillars, what you wish you were seeing more of from the multilateral institutions, what you wish you were seeing a little bit less of. And I guess I should throw the IMF in there too, in terms of the work in the governance and public financial management, public administration area. What would you like to tell us?
Thank you very much. Let me take the last one over here, Melissa, behind you. And then I'll come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Eliza, and I'm
Speak into the mic.
All right. Hi, my name is Eliza, and I work at CNFA. You've mentioned a couple times climate resilience in agriculture, but we know that within the next 11 years, we have to get not only to net zero, but we have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So do you know if there is any role for regenerative agriculture and agricultural development in these regions? And if so, how big a role do you think that could play?
Thank you very much. Panelists, we have a very rich set of questions. May I ask you to be relatively selective and then engage in a conversation after, so I can take online if possible. And perhaps I start with Danielle, since there were a number of governance-related questions, if that's okay, and then I'll pick up with the rest. Yes.
Okay, so thanks for these questions. This first one about the budgets and how to kind of get more attention to budgets to rural areas. I think this is really critical. You may know that IFPRI has spent a long time looking at public expenditures, particularly in agriculture, including by Schengen, and that we do have a SPEED database that looks at kind of sectoral allocation of expenditures. Not necessarily to rural areas, but divided by sector, agriculture, health, education. There are some also really interesting initiatives, like Nigeria has this budget initiative that allows citizens to see online where state and federal budgets are going into different sectors. I think your question that brings up a bigger issue about, sometimes we talk about rural revitalization, sometimes we talk about agri-food systems. Which type of expenditures should we be looking at? Because if we're interested in agri-food systems, we're not just focusing on rural areas. So kind of thinking through what type of message or what type of tracking we're actually interested in. Ministries of food systems, I don't personally know of any ministries of food systems at the national level. I do know at the Bangladesh. But I do know a lot of urban municipal governments have tried to have some type of ministry or kind of municipal coordination around food systems. South Africa has done this, a number of cities in South Africa. That relates to the other question, I think, from a colleague from Costa Rica on intersectoral, multi-level engagement. There are a lot of countries that do have some type of coordinating mechanism for that. The problem is sometimes they're not budgeted properly. I think a lot of our nutrition colleagues have found that before in the nutrition space, at least. This becomes more pronounced when we talk about agri-food. We're talking about environment, industry, labor, a broader range of ministries we need to have coordinated. There are, as I alluded to, these presidential delivery units that have been used in some countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa, Ghana's trying this, Tanzania tried it, where it is about interministerial coordination, and it's located in the office of the president or the prime minister, and it's around specific targets that are coordinated with the national development strategy.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Schengen, did you want to come in?
Sure. I think on the local government, the local government should have its own ability to generate revenue. And that's one of the findings we did some years ago. If the local government just receive the central sort of transfer, they just allocate the money, then they have no incentive to develop the economy to generate revenue. To generate revenue, and then it has the power to allocate the revenue, set the right priority. That's very critical. Now, the rural-urban migration, yes, it's happening pretty fast in some of the emerging economies, Vietnam, India, and beyond. In China, the migration has come down a little bit because one is obviously the population growth has come down. The second is we have seen some reverse migration That's exactly what we have been talking about, rural revitalization. Because of improved infrastructure, business opportunities, living conditions, many young people begin to return to their hometown, including some of my own relatives. Now, on the IFPRI, the multinational institutions, I think they focus on one sector, either agricultural or maybe smallholder agriculture. I really hope they can focus on certain territory or area, let's say rural areas, by bringing all the sectors together, let's say in a local government or in a local community. Can we bring education, health, social protection, agriculture, food, environment all together? I have not seen any multinational institutions supporting that. I think some years ago, the World Bank or community-driven program, right, to some extent, it has some sort of element to that. So I think multinational institutions can do more on that. Now, on the climate resilience, I think maybe Channing could come on that. I think the one is the technology. There are lots of technologies can help to increase production productivity on the one hand and reduce carbon emission on the other. So we have seen some technologies from CGIAR centers, Summit, IFPRI, and so on. Then institutional reforms and policy reforms. We mentioned about the subsidies. The current subsidies does not promote, let's say, the reduction of climate mitigation. They use too much water, too much energy, output support. So can we convert some of these subsidies to promote climate resilient technologies or even mitigation technologies?
Ruth, did you want to come in? If any of the panelists want to come in,
well,
briefly.
To connect your point, Rajul, about water and the issue of private sector and picking up, I shouldn't have left it with such a negative thing, because we've been doing work in Ghana and Tanzania on public-private partnerships for irrigation development. And there certainly are a few companies that are coming in with very good intentions. What often happens, where it breaks down, is something goes wrong and nobody's clear whose responsibility it is. So one of the things that we've come up with is just a way of coordinating across the whole value chain so that we have looking at which of the multiple government agencies, central line agencies and local government, have responsibility for what? What does that big company have, but also what are the responsibilities or roles of a lot of the smaller local companies in feeding pieces of that supply chain or the market processing, and getting that all together. So let me bring in, when we talk about governance, there's often a focus on governments, but we're doing a lot of work on multi-stakeholder processes, and water is especially an area where getting watershed groups together, often there's private sector companies are really concerned about critical sustainable water supply systems, or energy companies for when there's hydropower, or urban people wanting to know what's happening in the watershed. And so you can bring together civil society and private sector and government in these multi-stakeholder platforms to really address the problems together. The problem is that it's not overnight. It really has to be seen as an investment. And it's going to not solve the problem within 6 months. You have to build trust. And I think if we start to see these kinds of things as necessary investments rather than just, oh, that's kind of cute, and we're really going to focus on the hard stuff, with the money going in, that might be helpful.
Ruth, thank you very much. Hazel, James, and then Jamie and Channing.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to respond to Jorge's question on the indigenous communities. What I really like about the Reach, Benefit, and Power framework is that we can really extend this to look at other types of vulnerable communities that we want to work with. So, for example, for indigenous communities, I would recommend sort of thinking through how are you reaching them, how are you benefiting them, and how can you empower them. And I think once if you're able to think that through in sort of a systematic way, then that can really help in designing sort of more effective interventions and policies. Yeah, so I think I'll end there.
I'll be very quick. On the issue of migration, new research is showing that actually most rural youth who leave their rural communities are actually moving to other rural areas, and it's often into those peri-urban areas that I was talking about. And these are areas that are in the shadow of the city. They're not within the mandate of a municipal government to develop, and they're also not rural enough for the Ministry of Agriculture, or not agriculture enough for the Ministry of Agriculture to focus on. And so they sort of fall through the cracks. And so I think, to come to IFAD, I'm trying to tie it all together, I think what's needed is a differentiated approach to get to that very large number of rural people who are living in that gap that isn't being addressed. And I think IFAD and the World Bank are well positioned with your investment, I was going to say mentality, orientation, to engage with the private sector and to be that broker, like I was saying, to have those forums. But it requires a different role, I guess, within IFAD, thinking about what your mandate is. Is it policy or is it just hard investments? And within the World Bank, for example, to have an ag GP and an urban GP, global practice groups, you need to think about ways to sort of bridge the gaps between these silos. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and then Channing. Switch the mic on.
3 points. The first about climate change. Land use change and agriculture accounts for about 1/4 of our global greenhouse gases, but we can flip that equation. Nature-based climate solutions could contribute up to 38% of our climate emissions problem through such simple techniques as low-till or no-till, biochar, composting, microbial amendments, etc. Secondly, about water security. 3,200 cities around the world could improve their water security by 10% or more at a cost of $2 per person per annum with one simple technology. It's called a tree. Reforestation has the ability to transform our water security. And then third, how do we make this happen? How do we catalyze private sector finance? Working at UNDP, we often say achieving the SDGs is a cost of 2 to 3 trillion annually. But we need to rethink that and say it's actually an investment opportunity of 12 trillion annually. Just to give one example, if I may, if we think of agricultural waste and crop residues, the agricultural waste from just 5 products, banana, pineapple, hemp, flax, and sugarcane, could entirely replace our synthetic fiber, our entire fiber needs 2.5 times over. Think about the investment opportunity in that.
Okay, and before I come to Channing, I want to give a heads up to the entire panel that I'll come to you for closing remarks, about 10, 20, 30-second final message you want to leave, and I'm going to start with James afterwards. Channing, this is your response time, not the 10 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a few comments. You don't have a food systems ministry everywhere, but you do have a Ministry of Plan and Finance somewhere, almost everywhere. And if that food systems ministry is not getting support from the Ministry of Plan and Finance, it's not going to work anyway. So one of the targets, and obviously, how you get public expenditure routed into rural areas. There's politicians, there's all sorts of things, but the Ministry of Plan and Finance, or whatever it is in your country, is a key place. And actually, in terms of the research that we do here at IFPRI, I think really a key target. I think James covered nicely the point on migration. One of the other points is, Africa has a growing rural population, partly because the rural population is so big. Like you take Ethiopia, it's 80% rural, 20% urban. If you try to move 10% of the population from rural to urban, you're going to almost double the size of the city. It's just impossible. So that's why there's so much rural to rural, and that's a phenomenon that we don't understand as well as we really need to, and we should. Security implications in the military. I participated in a whole workshop on this. There's obviously a lot of possibilities for information exchange and being more positive in terms of. The military knows a lot. AFRICOM, U.S. AFRICOM, they know a lot, and they want to know a lot. There's things we know that they don't know. Now, there's a big bunch of cultural problems and other perception problems for how you actually get to that key. And we haven't solved that, but there's a lot to be done. On multilaterals, I would re-emphasize, the catalytic role that multilaterals have to play. We're all small. Every one of us is small. These governments are dominating everything now at this point. It used to be that aid was big, and now it's small almost everywhere, and it's even small in a lot of lower income countries, and we really have to bear that in mind. Finally, the ag role in climate change mitigation, and this is just piling in really fast. It's going to be a huge agenda item over the coming years. I think based on some of the slides that I showed, we're not there yet in energy, but there's a clear path for electrification. There's a reasonably clear path in transport, and this brings the 25% of emissions that are coming from agriculture globally into really big relief in terms of meeting the mitigation efforts. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I so much wish we could continue the conversation with the online audience, with the people in the room. At this time, I will ask the panelists to do a quick, whatever final message they want to leave with you. I will encourage you, if you want to have time, stay on, interact individually, and most importantly, read the report. There are full chapters in there. There are regional chapters in there. There are indicators in there. There is a synopsis. There are videos. There are many other resources we have on our website. This is only the tip of the iceberg here, but a wonderful tip of the iceberg. Each of our panelists, your final remarks, James.
So I guess I would say, to summarize everything that I've been trying to get across, it's that the future of rural employment lies in the agri-food system, and the future of the agri-food system lies beyond the farm. And that means we need to do a lot more work with the private sector and a lot more work with ministries other than just the Ministry of Agriculture.
Excellent. Hazel?
So imagine you could put on a pair of glasses that give you some superpowers. I call that the gender lens. And what that gives us is the ability to see the world with an extra dimension, how gender dynamics influences all the other things we care about in development. And it's not always a rosy picture. Sometimes there are trade-offs. It's not always synergies with these other things we care about, but it gives us this extra information that helps us do our job better.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ruth?
Thanks. I would say that partnering with rural women and men in their efforts as custodians of the rural environment is critical for the well-being of all of us.
Thank you. Schengen?
Yeah, about 10 years ago, Derek Bioney led an effort to develop the WDR, the World Development Report, that was focused on agriculture. I think it is time to look at the rural development. Well, agriculture will be part of that. I know the IFPRI and others have done some limited work over there. Much more effort is needed to look at the rural areas. Yes, we need a good policy, good investment. I think more importantly is a good governance structure. I've heard from you. And the most important, most critical, is people. How we're going to empower rural people, women, men, youth, and even indigenous community. So until we empower them, probably will not be able to move very far.
Thank you. Danielle?
Okay, well, I guess my final point would be when we think spatially, we often think of the rural-urban spectrum. But if you think in terms of governance, these are actually quite discrete units. You don't have a spectrum. You have very weakly resourced rural areas. You have better resourced urban areas that tend to often be opposition strongholds, so often bypassed by national governments. So I think if we're thinking about pushing rural revitalization through strengthening rural-urban linkages, we really need to better marry our economic and geographical perspectives with public administration and political one.
Thank you. Jamie?
3.5 years ago, the world committed itself to an ambitious agenda for people, prosperity, and planet. We need to reimagine rural renaissance for the world. But we must do more than exercise our imagination. We must recommit to a planet, a healthy planet, happy people, and a prosperous world. And that means we need to have an action agenda, and I encourage all of us to do so.
Thank you. Channing?
So food, energy, and water. If we can handle those issues by 2050, both globally and for poor people, then we will have done really well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we bring the event to a close. Read the report. Thank you.